Family Guy is a series I have a, shall we say, tumultuous relationship with. I watched it a ton when I was younger, but sort of grew away from it. And while I've made videos in the past about some of the problems I and some other people have had with the series, hate may have been the wrong word to use. While I don't necessarily like the show as much as I used to, I still have a lot of respect for what the series has managed to accomplish in its over 20 seasons on the air. So let's clear the air, so to speak. Let's talk about the series in the form of an iceberg video. This iceberg chart I'm using is one I got off of Reddit. I will link that down in the description below. And since I've done quite a few iceberg videos on the channel by this point, and there's always like one guy who gets really upset when I explain what iceberg videos are, I figured I can probably keep the description of what exactly an iceberg video is pretty brief. I'm going to go through each point from top to bottom and discuss each of them. The top are more well-known theories or facts, and as you go further down into the dark unknown, things start to get a bit weirder and sometimes more abstract. And do I need to put a spoiler warning for Family Guy of all shows? Surely we're fine without it, right? There's not much that can realistically be spoiled or anything, and you've kinda gotta expect it. And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Quagmire hates Brian. To say Quagmire and Brian have a rocky relationship would be putting it incredibly lightly. Quagmire has been very straightforward with his hatred of Brian, so instead of just saying this and moving on, let's kind of look at how their relationship has changed throughout the series. Now, this might actually surprise you, but Brian and Quagmire didn't actually directly interact until season 4 of the series, and they were kind of adversarial right off the bat. Their first major interaction is season 4, episode 7, Brian the Bachelor, where Brian and Quagmire are both competing on The Bachelor. The next few times they interact are fairly forgettable. But then, in season 8, episode 7, it's revealed that Quagmire absolutely hates Brian. And while Brian spends the bulk of the episode trying to make Quagmire not hate him, Quagmire just sort of goes off on Brian. It's a very long and kind of difficult speech to get through. And from this point onward, their relationship is set. Quagmire hates Brian. Quagmire becomes more and more of a cat person over time, and Brian being, well, Brian. And Brian doesn't really start to reciprocate the hate for Quagmire until Brian begins dating Ida briefly in season 8's episode, Quagmire's Dad. And this is kind of where they linger. They mainly hate each other, but will very occasionally come together in spite of their hatred to help each other with something more important, like when Stewie got lost in Paris in season 21, episode 7. Family Guy Online. Family Guy Online was an MMORPG, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that released its beta version April 12, 2012. The game was initially supposed to be designed to appeal to both casual and more hardcore gamers. And while a lot of the time game studios are the ones licensing these types of games, this was actually developed by 20th Century Fox themselves, alongside Roadhouse Interactive, a games company that went defunct in 2016. Since this was an MMO, you weren't going to be playing as the Griffin family. Instead, you'd be creating your own character loosely based off the Griffin family, with the different classes being based on different family members. Like Stewie being a ranger, Peter being a tank, and Loiss being a healer. Which feels kind of wrong to me. Does that make sense to anyone else? Peter being a tank feels right, but Loiss feels like she'd be more of kind of like a rogue or something to me. And Stewie should be like some kind of magic class like warlock or wizard or something. Is this just a me thing? Comment down below on this, I guess. Anyways, while the game released its beta version in 2012, it never actually released the full game, with the announcement coming that the game would be discontinued in December of 2012 and going completely down on January 18th, 2013. And surprisingly, they actually fully refunded anyone who made purchases up to 60 days prior to the announcement that the game was going to be shutting down. From what I've been able to see from some of the surviving footage of the game, the quest rewards would give like a short cutaway for the show alongside the typical MMO experience. I can see why the game didn't quite take off as much as they would have liked. It seemed a bit pay to win because they were offering character slots, skills, consumables, and gear in their in-game store, which is a great way to de-incentivize players to grind out your game. You can find some videos of this game around if you look for it. It wasn't that long ago, all things considered. I'll link the video I'm using down in the description. Time travel. Time travel is a pretty consistent thing throughout the series' run. Stewie very famously is a time machine that's used many times by different combinations of the series' characters. It makes its first appearance in Season 1, Episode 4 for Stewie to avoid teething. There's the famous time where Stewie goes to the future with his future self, but that uses a different time machine that's used for vacationing. In Season 7, Episode 3, Stewie, Brian, and Mort end up stuck in the early stages of World War II Europe. Season 9, Episode 16 has Brian and Stewie facing off against Bertram, who's trying to kill Leonardo da Vinci to erase Stewie from existence. In Season 10, Episode 5, Stewie and Brian travel back to the pilot of Family Guy many times. In Season 11, Episode 4, it turns out that Brian has been using the time machine to hook up with women. In Season 12, Episode 8, Stewie uses the time machine to keep Brian from dying. Also, it's actually like the 10th anniversary of that whole thing. In Season 12, Episode 21, Stewie uses the time machine to see what life would be like as part of a different family. In Season 13, Episode 7, Brian, Stewie, and Chris end up trapped on the Titanic. In Season 18, Episode 15, Brian goes back in time to fix Stewie after he's accidentally turned into a normal baby. In Season 21, Episode 15, Brian and Stewie go to the Titanic again in order to avoid having to listen to Loiss describe her dream. But as we've mentioned in this part already, there are also some other means of time travel in the series itself. Future Stewie comes back in time on vacation, so time travel does become canonical to the series at some point. And we also see Peter sent back in time and into his past body by death, where he screws up his whole life. That's Season 5, Episode 18. Brian dies. Brian's death is one of the most talked about Family Guy moments of all time. And it's kind of weird to me that I'm actually writing this on the 10-year anniversary of that whole arc. It really makes me feel old. Life of Brian was the episode that kickstarted this arc, something that we don't really see a lot of in Family Guy, multi-episode arcs. Typically, the series resets at the end of an episode unless they're introducing a new character or something, but not this time. In the episode, Brian is hit by a car and killed, and while normally when something like this happens, Stewie would take his time machine into the past and fix things, he and Brian just destroyed his time machine after another fun and quirky misadventure. And after he's unable to get what he needs to rebuild the time machine, Stewie and the rest of the family all have heartfelt goodbyes with Brian in his final moments. It's always a bit jarring to see moments like this in a show like Family Guy, where the moment isn't constantly being undercut by jokes or cutaways. This was huge. It was talked about on the news. It was a major character in a huge show. It made waves. And they pretty quickly replaced Brian's character with a new dog, Vinny, an Italian-American stereotype. The show from here just kind of kept on keeping on. Business as usual. Just Vinny instead of Brian now. For like an episode anyways. Brian was ultimately brought back a few weeks later in Season 12, Episode 8. Seth MacFarlane, creator and voice of like half the show, said that the point behind all this was to remind people, quote, "Never take those you love for granted. They can be gone in a flash." A nice message for Christmas, but ultimately this was mainly just a publicity stunt. It was the most news the series had gotten in a long time, and I think a lot of people probably ended up watching these next few episodes because of all the news. As the series continued on, they would continue to kill more characters off, but nothing would ever hit quite as hard as the time Brian was killed in a hit and run. Diane Simmons. Speaking of killing off characters, let's talk about Diane Simmons. For a solid portion of the early series, Diane was half of the main news anchor duo, working beside Tom Tucker. but her character ultimately culminated in the season 9 premiere, and then there were fewer. In this episode, a lot of recurring characters in the series began dying, being murdered to death, including Muriel Goldman, James Woods, Derek Wilcox, who was only in one other episode before this anyways, and a few characters who only show up in this episode. No one really cared about them, but they were actually killed throughout the episode by Diane Simmons, though that wasn't revealed until the very end. The whole episode is actually set up as a mystery, a whodunit. And when Lois finds out at the end that it was actually Diane, Diane prepares to kill Lois to cover everything up. But just as she's about to pull the trigger, a single sniper shot rings out. Stewie comes in with a save, claiming he's going to be the one to kill Lois and no one else. You remember when that was the thing? When Stewie was evil and trying to kill Lois?
Finish up, honey, then I'll put you down for a nice nap.
No, I shall put you down for a nap, Mother.
Simpler times. The question ultimately comes down to why? Why did Diane kill several people and try to pin the blame on Tom Tucker? Well, Diane, it turns out, was just turning 40, and she was about to be replaced as an anchor by a younger woman. And by getting Tom arrested for murder, her tenure on TV would be secured for the time being. A not super well thought out plan. Cleveland's divorce. Cleveland Brown is one of Peter's neighbors and closest friends. For a while, he had his own spin-off, which I really don't want to talk about right now. I didn't like it. Maybe I'll do a video on it in the future or something, who knows. But at the beginning of the series, Cleveland was married to one Loretta Brown, though Loretta would eventually cheat on Cleveland with Quagmire in an episode that might actually have my favorite episode name in Family Guy, the Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire. Though we do later hear from Donna, Cleveland's second wife, that Peter told Donna that Loretta cheated on him with many different men. The reason for the divorce, aside from just doing some actual character growth for a bit, is pretty straightforward. Alex Borstein, the voice actress who voices Lois and a bunch of other female characters in the series, was actually also the voice for Loretta Brown. And she at some point mentioned to Seth MacFarlane that the deep gravelly voice that she did for Loretta was super taxing on her vocal cords. So instead of recasting the character or anything like that, they just decided to retire the character instead. But to be honest, this is something I've seen stated a bunch on the internet, but I've never seen like a direct source for it, so it might just be completely made up, giving Cleveland a chance for some interesting growth that would ultimately result in the Cleveland show and eventually Loretta's untimely death. Brian's parents. Brian's parents are mentioned only a few times throughout the series run, and his mother only makes very minor quick appearances. Let's go over what we know. Brian's father, Coco, is only ever mentioned a few times. First, in Season 4, Episode 2, it's revealed that Brian's father's name was Coco and that he was hit by a milk truck, like it's the 60s or something. In Season 4, Episode 4, where it's revealed that Brian has some racist tendencies because of his father, this is later reiterated upon in Season 5, Episode 7. And Season 11, Episode 11, Brian says that he wishes his father was still alive to see him receive a made-up Good Boy award. As for his mother, her name was Biscuit. Brian was taken from her on a puppy farm when he was very young. We do actually see her alive and well in a flashback, and then as a taxidermy dog in Season 2, Episode 13. There's a few jokes here and there, like where Stewie was saying he was...
Yeah, 'cause I was up super late last night beefing your mom.
My mom's dead.
Yeah, 'cause I beefed her to death.
Talking animals. Speaking of Brian, the rules for animals in the series seem a bit vague. Who can talk and who can't is about as random as who can understand Stewie and when. For starters, Brian's mother we were just talking about seems to have been a non-talking dog. And even the man who owned Biscuit knew Brian as the puppy who was able to talk, which seems to imply that none of his brothers or sisters were able to. So it's not something that's fully genetic, though we do see one of Brian's relatives who's able to speak, his cousin Jasper, who has appeared in a lot less episodes as the series has continued. But outside of Brian's family, we do see the occasional animal that can talk. Vinny, who we've already talked about, the formerly evil monkey who used to live in Chris's closet, Tim and his family from the Cleveland show, which I unfortunately can't get away from. I don't know if you can hear my cat that just decided to come in. I'm gonna go let him out real quick. And of course, there's Klaus from American Dad, though he seems like he might be a bit of a special case. We know that Klaus wasn't naturally a goldfish who could talk. Instead, his mind was put inside of a goldfish by the CIA in order to keep him from winning in the 1986 Winter Olympics. Duh. But at a certain point, it kind of makes you wonder, is the CIA just doing this for all animals? Most likely not. For starters, no one is really that surprised when Klaus talks. The family is way more concerned with keeping Roger hidden than making sure Klaus doesn't say anything. But we also see Brian as a puppy who was able to talk, so it seems strange that he would have been put in such a young dog, and also that he wouldn't have any memories from before this. Klaus, again, remembers everything. But that doesn't mean that all of these different animals aren't descended from a few people who were put into the bodies of animals. Family Guy is a show within a show. A show being a show within a show is something that we've seen happen a few different times, and is also something that sounds way more complicated than it is. This is the way The Simpsons portrayed itself a few times, and is also how Family Guy has been portraying itself as well. While most of the time we see the family unit as pretty typical in terms of an animated show, the show goes out of its way to reinforce to us that Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian are all actors, that we're watching a more normal-ish TV show. This allows them to break character and get more meta. They break the fourth wall with this fairly regularly. We've seen things like a live studio audience, even though the show has no laugh track. Many different interactions of the opening that sort of breaks down what's happening, including a dancer telling Peter she's pregnant. Meg Has a Child. So at face value, this seems like it would be referencing the recent, at the time of writing this, episode where Meg serves as a surrogate for Bruce. She gives birth to a baby girl and eventually allows that child to be raised by Bruce and Jeffrey. And while that would fit super nicely, that doesn't take into account that this list was actually created like 2 years before that episode ever came out. So that leaves us with two possibilities. First is the theory that Stewie is actually Meg's child. We'll put a pin in that for now, it comes up later. Next is this really quick one-off joke where Meg opens her locker and there's a baby. The baby calls Meg Mama before she exclaims,
"What are you doing out of your box?"
and throwing a book on it. After cancellation, set in another universe. Family Guy has pretty famously been cancelled and brought back, and a lot of fans and detractors both point to this being the point where the series really begins to change. Which I think is fair. If your show got cancelled, even if it ends up being brought back, I can definitely see why you'd want to tweak the series at large. But this change had some people scratching their heads and brought about this theory we're going to be talking about. That the series before and after the show's cancellation might be occurring in different universes. This Reddit post goes into pretty good detail with the theory, so I'll link that below and summarize for now. The first example used is the notable change in Brian's religious views. While he was never outright religious in the early series, he does mention God a few times. Most notably in Season 2, Episode 9, where Brian straight up tells Peter,
"You want an explanation? God is pissed!"
Before we later find out in Season 7, Episode 11, that Brian is unequivocally an atheist. There's also the treatment of Meg, which takes a pretty steep turn after the show's revival. Let's start with looking at Season 1, Episode 3, where we get a flashback to Meg's first birthday party, while Peter comes in and is incredibly excited about a bunch of Meg's firsts, including her first word, first steps, and first drum solo. You know, the usual stuff. This stands in direct opposition to Season 11, Episode 2, where we see Peter and Lois trying to abandon a young Meg at a fire station. In fact, almost all of the characters see a bit of character degradation as the show has continued. Peter, of course, went from a lovable idiot to a pretty horrible person. Brian's fall could and has been talked about in entire videos. Stewie went from an evil genius who wants to murder his mother to a shadow of his former self who shows his intelligence much more rarely. It's a process known as flanderization, and that mainly just boils down to one trait of a character being exaggerated more and more over time until it completely consumes the character. But this change in universe could be something of an explanation for all that's happened. Loiss Affair. Throughout Family Guy's run, Peter and Lois's marriage has been portrayed very differently at different points in the series. At some points, they're considered soulmates, and them being together is hugely important for the series. Other times, they're in a marriage that's holding on by the thinnest of threads. And this point talks about Lois's affair. This point is, I think, referencing the episode Bry Robot, an episode where while Peter, Joe, and Cleveland are following Quagmire, we see Loiss walking around with some random guy while in sunglasses and trying to look a bit incognito. They both look shocked to see Peter, so the implication here is fairly straightforward. There was some online discourse around this time that was wondering if there's going to be like a divorce arc for the show, but there's like no way that would happen in a show like this. They aren't going to change the status quo quite that much. Though this could also be referencing that Peter might actually not be Meg's father after a throwaway line we hear back in season 3 about one Stan Thompson being Meg's actual father. The characters can't age. The timeline in Family Guy is a smidge strange, and it seems like I can't really do an Iceberg video without at some point getting into the idea of floating timelines. So real quick, a floating timeline basically means that the story is essentially ignoring actual timelines until it suits the story. So the characters aren't actively aging and changing unless they want to tell a different story and need a character to fill that role. This basically means the story is kind of always taking place in modern time and that the characters are all staying right around the same age forever. They can't age. This creates some weird moments within the show itself. Though one character we've seen and heard is actually aging is Meg, who was 15 when the show began and is now 18. But we also have to deal with the weirdness that is, how old is Stewie supposed to be? He's had like 10 first Christmases, he's in preschool sometimes, though if we go off what I refer to as the Meg timeline, it would make sense that Stewie is around 3 or so. Peter's age has been, well, not consistent at all either. He was 43 in season 5, he reverts to being 42 in season 14, episode 14, and then suddenly he's 58 in season 15, episode 17. Check out this video for way more details on this, I'll link it below as well. Peter is possibly bisexual. Peter, despite being married to Loiss for the entirety of the series, has been shown to have some bisexual tendencies at many different points. And by bisexual tendencies, I mean they tend to be pretty overt with it. We get a lot of references and directly see it a few times. For instance, there's season 11 episode 22, where Peter is at a pride parade and is shocked to see himself up on one of the floats. Or there's this episode where Peter just basically straight up says he's bisexual. It's not really much of a possibility, it's just kind of a fact. I remember reading this Reddit post a while back, I'll see if I can find it after I rate this bit, but it was talking about how Peter being bisexual was kind of subversive in the early 2000s, but it's kind of more of a tired bit now. Stewie is Meg's child. This is a follow-up to an earlier post I'd talked about, the Meg Has A Child bit. But now we're going to be talking about a very specific theory about how Stewie is actually Meg's child and not her brother. This all comes from a single Reddit post, I'll link that down below. But in short, this theory puts forward that at some point before the series actually started, some random guy got Meg pregnant, and that Brian and Loiss decided to pass the child off as Lois's. Brian and Loiss being the only people in the family who would realistically notice. Peter probably wouldn't have noticed. I mean, he barely noticed when Meg was acting as a surrogate for Bruce. Though, to be fair, I guess he was on drugs at that time. And Chris is the kind of person you could probably convince of just about anything. So it's really just Brian and Lois keeping the whole thing under wraps. And I know what some people out there are thinking. Hey, we've seen Stewie's birth before. We know it has to be Lois that's his mother. But it's important to note that we've really only ever seen this from Stewie's perspective, so it's certainly possible that we're not quite seeing the whole picture, so to speak. There's also a part in another episode, Season 8, Episode 21, where Lois makes a joke about Meg being Stewie's actual mother, and Meg seems completely unfazed by this. Maybe it's something she already knew. The Griffins are a product of incest. Okay, so, right off the bat, this isn't saying that Peter and Lois are like brother and sister or cousins or anything like that. Instead, we're going a bit further back in time. Let's take a look at Season 4, Episode 27, The Griffin Family History. In this episode, we find out that one of Peter's ancestors, Nate Griffin, who was a slave in the 1800s, starts a family with Lois Laura Bush Lynn Cheney Pewtersmith, the sister of one of Lois's ancestors, essentially intertwining these families together several generations before Lois and Peter would eventually meet. And while this does mean that the current Griffin family is technically the result of incest, it's so heavily diluted at this point that it really wouldn't make a difference. Joe can walk. This is another fairly niche theory. It also, as far as I've been able to find, comes mainly from a Reddit post. And this theory essentially states that Joe, at least at the beginning of the series, was actually faking his disability. This theory is based off the inconsistencies of Joe's explanations of how he became paraplegic. In his first appearance, Season 1, Episode 5, Joe claims to have lost his ability to walk due to falling off a roof while fighting the Grinch. And while this could be viewed as a joke, it's not like it's a Christmas episode or anything. That'd be a hell of a story to just pull out. But then in Season 11, Episode 5, Joe mentions that he was actually shot by Bobby Briggs, and that this was actually what led to him being in a wheelchair. There's a couple reasons that this could be. First is the aforementioned multiverse theory, that this takes place post-universe change, the thing we talked about earlier. But what this theory puts forward is that Joe has trouble keeping his lies about this straight, that he might switch up the story when it's convenient and he might have forgotten what he told Peter and his friends. But is there any proof? Kind of? Season 3, Episode 5. We see Joe falling and spinning down a mountain. When he lands, his first reaction is to immediately stand up. Not to mention, it kind of looks like his legs are moving while he's falling down the mountain, but that's really about it. So with many of these theories, we eventually come to the same spot, the why. It's quite simple actually. The disability benefits. It's possible that Joe knew he was having another kid, didn't think they could afford it, moved towns and police stations, and decided to fake the injury to help pay for everything, while also continuing to work as a police officer and getting paid for that as well. Peter Griffin Jr. Peter Griffin Jr. was the fourth Griffin child, aside from all of the illegitimate children Peter fathered after donating an absolute ton of sperm over the years. Peter Jr. was really only mentioned once throughout the entire series run and was a quick cutaway joke, in Season 7, Episode 9. In the cutaway, we see Peter and Lois standing over a grave that says Peter Griffin Jr., with Peter saying,
"I thought if I shook him enough, he'd stop crying. I was kinda right."
The implication being that Peter killed the child by accident by shaking them too much. A pretty dark stain on the Griffin family. It's all through Stewie's eyes. Family Guy is a wild show. That's really the one thing everyone who has watched the show can agree on. You really never know where the show is going to be going or what's going to happen. And this theory does its best to try to explain some of the weirdness. You see, the whole show is actually being framed through Stewie's perspective. And that gives us a reason to sort of re-examine the entirety of the series. Everything is so crazy and off the walls because that's sort of how a baby would view things. Everything's new, everything's changing. Why does Dad disappear all day? He must be off doing something insane. And that's why, at least initially, it seems like only Brian can understand him. And no one else can understand Brian. It's just a child playing pretend, thinking that he's the smartest person to ever exist. And that really would go a long way in terms of explaining just what is happening constantly in the series. It's all in Peter's mind. Here we are. Time for the traditional, "aw man, everyone was dead the whole time" portion of the Iceberg. This time, it's everyone else besides Peter who's dead. At least according to this Reddit post, which, I'm sorry, this is like the 90th Reddit post I'm crediting in this video. That's just where a lot of these theories seem to originate from. Anyways, let's start with Meg and Chris because they are the crux of this theory. Meg, unlike how she's viewed throughout the series, was a popular, attractive high school student. And Chris, for some reason, was born with a disability. I'm not sure why that's included in this post because it doesn't really add anything to the theory at large and nothing would be changed by excluding it, but whatever. At some point, Meg, who loves her brother, takes him to a party and on their way home, they crash their car and both die. Loiss, who can't handle the grief, Logan Pauls herself, while she was still pregnant with their next child, Stewie. So Peter is basically recreating his family in a newer image in his mind. He's upset and partially blames Meg for everything, so he reinvented her in his mind as being hated and bullied by everyone. Stewie, being unborn, had limitless potential, so he's a genius. But Peter also holds some resentment towards Loiss, which is why Stewie originally wants to kill her. Before everything happened, Peter himself was quite intelligent, but he blames himself for the death of his family. He now views himself as a big dumb idiot, and all facets of his intelligence manifested into a newer external personality, Brian. Quagmire and Cleveland were friends of Peter who still visit him from time to time, and Joe is someone who he's never actually met. But Quagmire and Cleveland told him about the new man who moved into his house, and Peter decided to add him to his delusions. Even the Cleveland show is accounted for. That's how Peter explains it to himself when Cleveland, for a time, stopped visiting. But in the end, this is all Peter's personal reality. One he's created, one where he's still a family guy. The Robin Williams episode. The Robin Williams episode, I believe, is referencing a very specific event that occurred some years back. Season 10, episode 22, titled Family Guy Viewer Mail, featured a vignette where Peter is granted a Midas-like ability where everything he touches turns into Robin Williams. While he originally loves this, he eventually starts going mad, and at the end of the episode, Peter tries to Logan Paul himself. That episode originally aired in 2012, but then in 2014, while the BBC Three had just finished re-airing the episode, the news came through that Robin Williams had been found dead. The coincidence between the reality and what's depicted in the episode, as well as the insanity of the timing, was fairly obvious. Boston bombing prediction. Usually, when you hear of a TV show predicting something, or something along those lines, your mind probably goes to The Simpsons. But in this case, a few months before the tragedy that was the Boston Marathon bombing, Family Guy aired an episode where Peter drove through a huge crowd of people at the Boston Marathon. This was noticed fairly quickly, and networks were quick to react. Fox pulled the episode from basically all streaming services and stated that they were not planning on re-releasing it at any point in the future. That's fair. This was a huge tragedy and horribly timed, even if it wasn't Family Guy's fault this time. Though the episode is currently available to stream. Scott Meslow wrote a really solid article for The Week that actually did its best to show that the Family Guy similarities were overblown. He brings up that some of what was circulating was actually two completely different clips that were edited together to make the whole thing seem worse than it actually was. The clip was actually partially spread around by Alex Jones, claiming it was a false flag, something that even Seth MacFarlane himself would speak out against. The edited clip, as far as I've been able to find, is currently unavailable on YouTube. Family Guy Lost Episode. This, I believe, is a reference to a Family Guy creepypasta, basically a spooky fanfic. This specific one I'm going to focus on goes through a story where the writer finds a supposedly lost episode of Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane apparently wanted to go real dark with it after the show was brought back from cancellation, so he wrote this super messed up episode. Oh man, Peter sees Meg naked, then drinks his own blood, and Meg kills him. Oh dang, so dark. Except not really, because he's still alive later in this story. At one point, the doorbell rings and Brian answers it, and you can't see who it is because of the mirror. You know, the mirror. Duh. Maybe it's me, but I really can't get into creepypastas. And to get a bit critical of the writing, though I probably shouldn't because my own writing is hot garbage, the story starts off with the writer explaining everything we kind of went over about Seth MacFarlane apparently wanting to do a super dark episode. But later, when he confronts Seth MacFarlane, he just denies everything. Where, in this story, did this information then come from? Also, the idea of someone buying a knockoff edgy Family Guy episode, then confronting Seth MacFarlane himself about it, and him just being like, dude, I have no idea what you're talking about, before starting to yell, is a hilarious image that I can't get out of my mind. And then a bunch of the author's friends die after he shows them the video, and he just ends the story with like, I was truly upset about this. Yeah, dude, that makes sense. There's probably some other creepypasta or random thing this point is supposed to be referencing. If you know what it might be, feel free to comment down below. And that, for now, is where I'm going to end this video. This has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Follow me on Twitter to stay up to date on everything I'm working on. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.